Welcome to Behavior, Evolution, and Culture speaker series. We are nearing the end of our academic year. This is the second to last talk of the year. Our next and final talk will be Professor Aaron Riley from San Diego State University, whose talk will be called Roadside Primates, Balancing Risk and Rewards in Anthropogenic Environments. That's on June 2nd here, so please join us for that. I will, we'll also wrap up in our last session and talk a little bit about next year. Susan Perry's going to be running back next year. And so, as always, we welcome suggestions from the Beck community.
Oh, God owned it.
Is this a sticky tape thing?
I'll retain it. It can stay there.
Okay.
My first name.
I'll
keep it.
Yeah. Yeah, and so if people have suggestions of people that they'd like to see, especially people who are local, who do research in the space of behavior, evolution, and culture that we may not know about, feel free to reach out to Susan or me with suggestions. And are we doing another taping? Should I wait until you tape it, or no? Okay. Great. And so this week, it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Annie Wertz, who has recently joined the faculty in psychology at UC Santa Barbara, coming there from a research position directing a research center at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin. We're really happy that Annie is now here in California and part of our evolutionary community here. Her talk is going to be how infants learn to eat plants and why they may not want to. Please join me in.
Well, thank you very much, Clark, and thank you for retaping this. We'll see how long this stays on. So it is such a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. Like Clark said, today I'm going to be talking about some of the work I've been doing looking at how infants learn to eat plants and why they may not want to. And this is part of my broader research program that looks at how infants and young children learn about plants and learn about plants from other people. And there are a lot of different aspects to this, but we're going to just focus largely on the eating aspect today. And I do want to flag that since I just joined UCSB, most of the work that I'm going to be talking about was done in my previous position, in my previous lab, where I was a research group leader at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin. And these are some of the wonderful people who I was lucky enough to work with over the almost 10 years I was there. And so most of this work is really theirs that I'm lucky enough to present to you. Now, I am getting my Lab for Infant Learning and Cognition off the ground at UCSB. We are very nearly set up, and next year actually we'll be recruiting graduate students. So if you know people who are interested, please have them give me a look. So why would we think that there might be systems for learning about plants in infancy? Some of you who have seen me talk before have probably seen me present this, where we have two plants that we're looking at here. Both of these plants grow in the same area of the Mountain West here in the United States. Both of them grow out of a little bulb. One of the bulbs from one of these plants were one of the traditional food sources for the indigenous Native American populations in the area. And the other bulb contains a toxin that is so deadly that one bite could kill you. So let's just do a quick show of hands. How many people think that the white one is the one that you can eat? And how many think the blue one is the one you can eat? So people who had your hands up at the end, you live to fight another day. But yeah, everybody else, sorry. And I really like this example because this is really the structure of the wild environment here. These are plants that really are there. And as this example illustrates, there aren't features of plants that reliably signal human-relevant edibility or toxicity. And a lot of this is because plants are in these coevolutionary relationships with all kinds of other creatures, many of which are insects, many of which have sensory systems that are very different from ours. So it actually poses a really difficult learning problem for young humans about how do I learn about the kinds of things that I can eat. How do I learn about the kinds of things that can kill me in the context of this kind of seemingly innocuous but actually very complicated system? And so this is what my work has been focused on for actually probably over 15 years now. I've been working on this. And even though this seems very difficult to us in this room with this example, this is clearly a problem that humans and lots of other animals have been solving for millennia. And so what my work is looking at is some of the cognitive systems that allow us to do that early in development. And like I said today, I'm going to start with just a little bit more of the theoretical background for those of you who haven't seen me talk about this work before, to just orient you to how I'm approaching this. Then we'll really focus in, actually I know the title was How They Eat Plants and Why They May Not Want to. We're actually going to flip that a little bit. We're going to start with why infants may not want to eat plants. And then we'll spend the bulk of our time looking at the research that I've done, investigating how infants do learn to eat plants. And then I'll close off with some very brief conclusions. So the theoretical background for this is that perhaps this isn't as true here in the department in UCLA, but just for many of us out in the world, we probably don't think about plants very much as we go about our day-to-day lives. The way that we tend to encounter them is in these kinds of settings where they're either in parks or they're in gardens. Maybe we are encountering them at supermarkets when we go food shopping, where a lot of the hard work of plants have been done for us. They've already been picked and processed and curated. Or maybe we're buying them as decorations in a garden center. But across the entirety of human history, these circumstances are not representative. In fact, they're very unusual, and you can even say that they're weird. Right? They're largely a product of the Western educated, industrialized, and rich and democratic societies in which many of us spend most of our time. But in a hunter-gatherer world, the way that humans interacted with plants was very different. Humans encountered plants in wild environments, and it wasn't just going to the wild environments to get away from everything else for a period of time. This is where people are making their living. And because there are no grocery stores, there's no garden centers, people are making their living out of the land and the wild environment around them, and plants are a really huge part of that. And the archaeological record and studies of modern societies that engage in hunting, gathering, and small-scale horticulture show that humans rely on plants for a lot of different things. So humans rely on plants for food, particularly the roots, fruits, and nuts of plants. Plant materials are used to construct a broad array of artifacts. And plant chemicals are used in a variety of ways, everything from poisoning rivers for fishing, poisoning arrows for hunting, medicinal uses, and ritual uses. But for all of these benefits that plants can have, they can also impose very serious costs. And this is because in order to protect themselves from the herbivorous predators that feed on them, plants have evolved a variety of what are called toxic secondary compounds that are, some of them are dangerous or even fatal to humans when they're ingested. And several plants have also evolved mechanical defenses too, things like thorns or stinging hairs. And as probably many of us know from this poison ivy, but poison oak around here, there are plants that have these excreting toxins that can cause serious skin injury, and in some case, they can cause systemic effects as well. And all of this is because, unlike animate entities, plants are literally stuck to the ground. And so in order to deter the predators, they have to evolve. They basically have turned themselves into little chemical weapons factories and with some pretty nasty external defenses as well. So the problem that humans have had to solve with respect to plants is what I alluded to in the beginning, is how do you figure out which ones are food and which ones are fatal? This is a difficult task. The stakes are high. For example, here's just another example. This one's cheating a little bit geographically, but you can still see, again, there are no features of plants that reliably signal human-relevant edibility or toxicity. So having simple rules in this case doesn't work. So for example, if you had a simple rule that was avoid all white flowers because the white flower we saw in the beginning was toxic, you would miss out on things like apples, pears, almonds. If you had a rule that was everything with a purple berry is safe, that may be fine if you're eating raspberry or if you're eating blackberries or something like that, but it would also cause you to eat deadly nightshade. So what this also means is that trial and error learning is exceedingly costly. So as a young child, an infant, somebody new in a particular location, they could go around and sample every plant and see what would happen, but the best case scenario is you spend a lot of time sick. The worst case scenario is that you die. And so instead, my argument has been that this set of circumstances would select for the evolution of social learning mechanisms that would gear infants and young children towards learning the information about plants from the more knowledgeable other people in their environment. And when I started doing this research program, this was just the logic that I had, that I thought this must be the case. And since then, I actually was able to work with an evolutionary biologist to do the modeling work on this, and this falls out of the math as well. And so my starting point here is that humans and human babies have a set of cognitive systems, which I call plant learning and avoiding natural toxins, or plant systems, that are there to balance the costs and benefits of learning about plants. Okay? And I want to be clear from the beginning here that the way I'm thinking about plant systems, I am not thinking that there's like one single bounded entity or module that is a plant system. I don't think that is plausible. Instead, the way that I think about this is that these plant systems, it's actually kind of a fuzzy set of cognitive systems that overlap with a lot of other kinds of systems. So for example, there is bound to be psychology that overlaps with broader threat avoidance and danger learning problems, social learning and cultural transmission more broadly, food learning and foraging, this is where we'll spend a lot of our time today, artifact reasoning for how you make things, and more basic processes like object identification, visual perception, and so on. So all of this means that my students and I are not going to run out of things to do for a while. And we're not going to touch on all of these, but I do just want to put this here so you know we're not studying a plant module, right? Like this is a set of systems. So for today, to keep things tractable, I'm going to leave this in the background, and I'm going to focus on just two areas of the plant systems and what my students and I have found about their structure. So we're going to start out by looking at how infants avoid plant dangers. And then we're going to look into the structure of some of the selective social learning mechanisms that seem to be geared for them to learn about plant edibility. So we're going to look here at how humans learn to eat plants and why they may not want to. Okay? So as I said, we'll start with the why they may not want to. Because I think in the way you'll see in the way that human babies kind of encounter plants, I think it makes sense to start with this. And I just want to take a quick step back and say that there is research looking at other aspects of ancestrally recurrent threats, including by Clark and his students, looking at how infants and young children respond to snakes, spiders, dangerous predators, and angry individuals. But as I alluded to earlier, plants are a fundamentally different kind of thing out in the world, and that's for a very simple reason. Plants are literally rooted to the ground, right? And so a dangerous plant is going to pose a different sort of problem for a young child than a dangerous animal. A dangerous animal can come sneak into your bed at night. It can come run after you. But for a dangerous plant, in order for you to get injured by the plant, you have to go approach it. It isn't going to approach you. And so what this means, do people know this plant. This is one I didn't really know before I got to Germany. So this is a giant hogweed, or Riesenbeerenklau. Riesen means huge. It is quite large. And this plant, if you brush up against it and then your skin is exposed to sunlight, you get a horrible rash, like a really bad kind of poison oak rash. This was also all around the Institute. There was the curated gardens there had it in my old research institute. But if you're going to get hurt by this, it's because you went and brushed into it. It didn't run after you when you were going into the building, for example. So an easy way for young children, infants and young children, to protect themselves, to minimize the kind of threat they would face from plants, is to minimize their physical contact with them. Quite simply, it can't hurt you if you don't touch it, right? So the first line of research that I will talk about today, our main prediction was when infants are initially confronted with plants, before they have any kind of information about them, what do they do? And the prediction was that all else equal, infants will take longer to reach out and touch plants than other entities. So we'll see some evidence that they are minimizing their contact with plants. So to test this is a study that we have done mainly with 8 to 18-month-old children. I can say now this is a broad age range for baby studies, especially baby studies done in places like Berlin where you have lots of babies around. The reason that we started with a broad age range like this is because we thought maybe there would be differences in how the babies behave toward plants across their different changes in motor abilities, right? I can say now we have not found that. So we started broad that way because we thought we might, but we have not. We find the same thing throughout this age range we have tested. And the way that the studies work is the baby is seated on the parent's lap. If you can see here, the parent's eyes are closed, and that is so the parent can't see which object is in front of their baby, so the parent's responses aren't influencing the baby's response. And there's an experimenter seated across the table, and the experimenter puts a series of stimulus objects down in front of the baby, one at a time in a randomized order, and says, look what I've got, or in German, schau mal, was ich hier habe. And you can kind of see potentially in the corner there's another research assistant in the back who hands the objects over in the designated order and who times the trials. These are the kinds of objects we've tested to see if infants really do show some evidence of avoiding contact with plants. We test real plants. Mainly these are kitchen herbs, things like basil, parsley, rosemary. We also test a series of artificial plants. We do this because the kitchen herbs tend to have a nice smell to them. So we wanted to make sure, first of all, that we weren't just accidentally testing babies avoiding things that smell versus things that don't. It's also the case that over the course of testing, some of the real herbs are more robust than others, and some of the less robust ones change and flop and die, and so we wanted something that was constant throughout testing as well. Then we make a series of novel artifacts that are matched to features of the plants. And we chose things like the green color to see if infants are just responding to green versus not green. We also made some of these objects out of the exact same leaves as some of these artificial plants, just cut off and arranged in non-planty ways. So sometimes when I show pictures of these, people think they look planty, and that's because they're made out of the same stuff, but when these are presented close in front of the infant, it's very clear they are not plants. Okay? It's just an effort to look at low-level features. Over many studies, we've also tested a series of familiar objects, because if you have plants versus these feature match control things, then you have something very novel versus something more familiar. So we have these familiar artifacts, and they range from things that babies would interact with and use a lot themselves, like the board books, to things they probably wouldn't, like the knife, which is actually a 3D printed knife. It was baby safe. So we have a range of different objects that we've used. And then we've also included other inanimate natural objects. So these are things like shells and stones and a little sea sponge. And we did this because we wanted to try to evaluate whether it was something about plants per se, or if it was naturally occurring things versus human-made things. because it could be that maybe babies are just smart about human-made objects and they understand on some level that these things are made by humans to be handled, right? So we wanted some other naturally occurring inanimate things as well. This is what these studies look like. This is a 14-month-old. So that's German for look what I've got. So we just put these things down in front of babies, and we video record what they're doing. And as you can see what happened there, the experimenter only ever handles the bottom part of the objects so that they're not cueing the baby's responses. We then, after the studies, we go through and research assistants who are blind to the hypotheses evaluate these videos, and basically, there's several different ways you can do it, but if they don't touch, they get a maximum trial length. If they do touch the top part, we code that. And then in this study, we were also interested in what they did after they touched it. Sometimes we took it away right away, sometimes not. But this is our 14-month-old here. Okay. And this is a representative set of data. This is the time, the latency until the babies reached out and touched these top parts of these objects and all the different object types on the bottom. And as you can see, as we predicted, infants took longer to reach out and touch plants versus all of the other object types. And you can analyze these data a couple different ways. You can look at how long it took them to reach out and touch. You can do they touch it, yes or no? And you get converging results that they're minimizing their contact with the plants. This is another set of data from a different study. This is the study that the little girl was in the video was doing. And here again, they're taking longer to touch plants versus other types of objects. And if you notice, there's the amount of time and the touch latency moves around, and that's because for some studies we had it there for 15 seconds, for some studies we had it there for 30. So the absolute level moves around depending on how you do the study, but the relative difference is there. And in fact, we've tested this in, I think we're at 8 different studies, 7 or 8 at this point. In short, as predicted, what we find across all these studies is evidence that infants take longer to reach out and touch plants than other things. And this kind of behavioral avoidance strategy would reduce infants' exposure to plant dangers like poisoning and physical injury by minimizing their contact with plants. And these replications, they're not just the same thing over and over again. We have also extended these findings. So for example, thanks to my former PhD student, Alexandra Wildarczyk, she was interested in what happens with thorns, because you can have deadly looking plants that are nice and pretty, but then you can have plants that have these sharp looking thorns. And what Alexandra found in her work is that infants are just as reluctant to touch these benign looking plants as they are to touch the plants with thorns. Which suggests to us that this avoidance strategy may be more fundamentally about avoiding these potential toxins, but there's still more work to do. Alexandra also found that once infants make contact with plants after their initial contact, they touch them less frequently than other objects, and their initial touch is a shorter duration. So this means that, in general, the strategy when infants are initially confronted with plants is an initial avoidance and a reduced subsequent contact. So taken together, all of the studies we've done on this topic have provided evidence that when first confronted with plants, infants seem to exhibit this behavioral avoidance strategy that includes this initial reluctance to touch and reduce contact after they do touch them in collaboration with people like Clark. We have also looked at this cross-culturally, and we see evidence that there's that aspects of this behavioral avoidance strategy are shared cross-culturally. Happy to talk about some of these studies in the question period too. We also have some work that suggests that it persists into adulthood, at least with German adults. And we have evidence that it's shared by some non-human primate species as well. So taken together, we have pretty good evidence at this point that infants initially avoid plants, and this may be part of why they don't want to eat them. If there's this initial strategy, this initial avoidance, this initial caution, this may be feeding into why infants may not want to eat plants when they are first confronted with them. And indeed, when you look at things like food neophobia, where children tend to avoid putting new foods in their mouths, that tends to peak at around 2 to 3 years of age, and it tends to be most active for things like fruits and vegetables. So the behavior that we see in the real world in infants sort of tracks that there may be some relationship here between this avoidance and the avoidance of plant foods. So there are good reasons why infants may not want to eat plants, especially in environments where they are more likely to be exposed to dangerous plants. But it isn't really an option to avoid all plants indefinitely. So now we're going to move on to talk about what we've been looking at, investigating if infants start with this initial reluctance, how is it then that they overturn this and learn what to eat? And we're going to touch on a couple different aspects of this. So we're going to start with, do infants seek social information about plants? Do infants differentially attend to food-relevant actions versus other kinds of actions? Do infants selectively learn about plant edibility? And once they learn that a particular plant is edible, do they generalize this edibility in sensible ways? So the first question here is really a simple question. If the argument is that this, fundamentally what infants are working with here to learn about plants is a social learning mechanism, do we see evidence that when they're confronted with plants, they look to the other people around them? We began by testing this just in a very simple way to look, do infants differentially seek out social information when they're confronted with plants? Again, we did this with 8 to 18-month-olds because that was the same age range we had used in the other studies. And the prediction here is that infants should look more to adults before making contact with plants. And this was work that was done with my former postdoc, Claudia Elsner. So this is how we did these studies. So here we put these same kinds of objects down in front of babies for a 15-second time window. And we had research assistants blind to the hypotheses evaluate both the infant's reaching and touching behavior and also their looking behavior. And we were particularly interested in looks that went from the stimulus object to the face area of the researcher. We did also code towards the parents as well, but we saw far fewer of those looks to the parents, which is consistent with other work on social looking. So we evaluated when they touched and how many of those looks that they did. We looked at a lot of different aspects of this, but just in the interest of time, I'm going to show you one piece of this, which is one of the analyses that we did looked at the proportional time they spent doing social looking before they reached out and touched, right? Because they're taking longer to reach out and touch plants. You want to make sure they just don't have more opportunities to look because the time is longer. So we looked at, given the amount of time before they did their touch, how much time did they spend doing social looking? And we found that as we predicted, they spend more time doing social looking for plants, both real and artificial, than the other object types. So, and we've also now replicated this finding in a set of studies with another set of, these are German infants, so we've replicated this with another set of German infants. Yeah?
Real plants and artificial plants different there?
Real plants and artificial plants, I think might be marginally different here, but they are, the reason I wouldn't make too much of a deal about this is because we also looked at frequency, we looked at overall duration, and we didn't see any differences between real and artificial in those. And so it's possible that the real plants, there's something going on about real and artificial, but overall, I'm more likely to think that this might just be an incidental thing.
Kind of works for your theory. Is different actually. A little bit.
Yeah, it does. I mean, it's the real and artificial thing across all the data sets we have, it does this, right? So like sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less, but sometimes artificial is there's more of something and sometimes there's less of something, but it's always, nearly always the case that the plants, both real and artificial, are separate from the other objects. So. Okay, so these studies gave us some indication that infants do indeed seek social information before touching plants. And what this suggests to us is this behavioral avoidance strategy is actually linked to later social learning. And one of the things that is worth mentioning at this point is what we saw with the plants is when a plant went down in front of the babies looked at the experimenter and then they reached for the plant. When it was the non-plant objects, they grabbed the non-plant object and then they looked at the experimenter. So they're doing social looking in both cases, but it seems to be tied to the fact that when you have a plant, it's something potentially dangerous, you probably want to look first. So there's some initial evidence here that infants do indeed seek out social information about plants. So they're geared towards looking towards the other people in the environment to figure out what they need to know. The next question is how they learn to eat plants and what actions are they specifically monitoring for out in the world that may indicate that plants around them are edible. The work I'm going to show you, we focused on two types of actions that we've been investigating. One is eating actions, so actually seeing somebody else put something directly into their mouths. The other are food processing actions. So watching somebody, we've done specifically watching somebody like cut something up or seeing things that have been cut up by somebody else. Now, watching somebody eat something else is a pretty straightforward indicator that that thing is edible. And our contention is that for humans, food processing may also be an indicator of edibility too. And this is because most of the foods we eat are processed in intricate ways prior to us consuming them. So for example, all of these plants together are harvested and chopped and cooked to make even just a pretty simple sauce, right? And this isn't something that's just a feature of modern environments or more industrialized societies. So for example, the Chumash people the indigenous Chumash people in Southern California, one of the staple crops was acorns. But in order to be able to eat acorns, there's a series of complex processing steps, which includes drying out the acorns, shelling them and then drying them again, tossing them in a winnowing basket to remove the skin, then grinding them with a mortar and pestle, and then leaching the ground acorn meal with water to remove tannic acid, and then finally cooking the acorn mush. So food processing is a critical component of human diets, and so we have begun investigating this because we think it's probably a pretty good candidate for a class of actions that could indicate edibility. And in fact, we have some evidence that infants are sensitive to cues of food processing. This is work that was done with my former postdoc, Camille Rioux, where we again used this time to touch paradigm where we put the objects down in front of the babies. But here we did whole plants, plants with fruits, and then plant parts that had undergone some degree of processing being removed from the plants or picked or cut. And then we had a series of control objects, including some highly processed foods. And what we found in this study was that infants their reluctance to touch was actually reduced for the plant parts that had shown some markers of food processing. So they seem to be treating things that have been processed in some way differently than these whole plants. So there's some reason to think they may be sensitive to cues of food processing. So what Camille and I did with my former PhD student, Carola Schlegelmilch, is we started again with a fairly basic question of, is there evidence that infants differentially attend to food-relevant actions? Right? If you show babies different actions, some that could indicate that some that are food relevant and some that aren't, what do we see them do with their attention? And here we use the eating action and the food processing action of cutting. And we did this with an eye tracker. So our dependent variables were gaze duration, how long did they spend looking at these different displays, and pupil dilation, which is a measure of arousal or cognitive involvement. We then also asked which of the food-relevant actions that we show to infants do they use to infer edibility. And to test this, our DV was infants' choices. So we showed them these actions performed on different plant foods, and then we presented them with the foods and asked them which one they could eat, and we saw what they actually chose. We did this with 12-month-old infants. We had 65 of them split across 3 conditions, and we used novel candidate food stimuli. And we asked our parents to make sure that our assumptions about this were correct, and they did indeed think these were novel for the babies. We used white parsnips and black carrots. So we used roots, but ones that babies don't see that often in their everyday kitchens. We showed videos, babies videos of 3 types of actions. We showed them an eating action, Camille picking up the root and putting it in her mouth and eating it. We showed food processing cutting, so taking one of the roots and cutting it into pieces. And then we came up with a touch control action where the actor here took the root to the side and then touched it, and we had a little shoehorn there, so there was even the presence of a tool to equalize things across conditions, but it allowed us to try to look at our infants paying attention to some of the more low-level features of what's going on with the action, or are they interested in the action type per se. And I just want to flag, because, and it's okay if you do, but people always forget when I say this, but root color is counterbalanced here, right? So across, I'm showing you, because of just the limits of things, I'm showing you one set of presentations across all of the babies that we tested. Some babies saw eating with the black carrots, some saw it with the white parsnips, some saw food processing with black carrots, some saw it with white parsnips, right? So everything is counterbalanced here so that we can try to rule out that babies are just responding to the color of the carrot or something like that. So let me show you what the actions actually looked like. The way that we did this study is we presented the actions side by side. And so when one action was going, the other side was blacked out or grayed out so that it wouldn't distract the baby's attention. But this is just to give you an idea, that's why it looks like this, but this is just to give you an idea of what they look like. So this is the eating action. These are German babies, so she's going to say hello in German.
Hello.
So again, we had tongs because we had a cutting action, and we wanted to make sure all the videos had a tool in them. Yeah. And then this is the food processing action. This is the cutting. Oh, right, and the video side was counterbalanced too here, right? So I'm just showing you examples, but across all the babies, these things were counterbalanced. Here's what the cutting action looks like.
Hello.
And here at the end of the video, she tucks her hair. And this is because in the eating one, her hand came up to her mouth, so we wanted her hand to come up to the face, and we wanted the videos to be matched overall for length. And Camille was doing this to like a metronome, basically, to try to make sure that the lengths of all of these things were as similar as possible. This is the touch control action.
Hello.
And the hair tuck again. So those were the 3 action videos that we came up with. And babies in this study participated in one of 3 between subjects conditions because we had video pairings. So there were 3 ways that these could be paired up. We did eating versus touch, which is, kind of similar to the kinds of work that people have done before, where you contrast an eating action with a control action that wouldn't necessarily indicate edibility. Same thing, cutting versus touch. So this is, do they differentially pay attention to the food processing action when it's contrasted with a touch action? And then we did eating versus cutting as well to see what happens if we directly pit these together. So if you were a 12-month-old in our studies, the first thing you would actually see is a still image of the 2 root types. So we could measure if there was a preference to look at one versus the other beforehand. Then we showed the alternating videos 3 times each, measured their gaze duration and their pupil dilation. Then we had an action still just to show things side by side where we measured their preferential looking. And then we ended the video presentation with another still of the roots so we could see if their looking behavior changed after seeing the actions applied to them. And then at the end, we did the choice and asked the babies, which one can you eat from those 2? And I'll show you how we did that now. So in the end, the babies would see those roots on the screen. That's the setup of the screen. That's one of our participants. And what we actually did is we had the research assistants come out and look like they were picking one of the roots of each type out of the screen and then handing them to the babies. So this is how we did that. It's a little bit hard to see, but you can see it better with the white one. This was post-COVID. So there, see, and she's got the root. So when the baby's sitting right there, the baby can see all of this. And then she kneels down in front of the babies. The baby shows them the roots, make sure they look at each one. And then she says in German, which one can you eat? Can you show me which one can you eat? And then puts the roots forward. And then we measure which one the baby touches. We did also intend to measure which one they ate, but so few babies tried to eat these delicious-looking roots for some reason that I think only maybe 12 babies out of the entire set of 65 tried to eat any of these, so we didn't end up analyzing those data. Okay, so do infants differentially attend to food-relevant actions? What I'm going to show you here is the proportional gaze data, so how long did they spend looking during each of the videos. We had those 3 separate conditions, but we actually found that there were not differences between the 3 conditions, so we collapsed our data down, so I'm just showing you how long they spend looking at each of these action types. And what we saw is that babies spent a longer time looking at the food processing action and the eating action than they did the touch control. So they seem to spend more time looking at these food-relevant actions. And when we look at pupil dilation, which is, again, it's a measure of arousal or cognitive involvement, we actually saw kind of an inverted thing. So here we're seeing that the food-relevant actions are being treated differently than the non-food-relevant action, but it's in the other direction where it's kind of like, if you think about this as the level of arousal or cognitive involvement, they're thinking harder about that touch action, right, at a very colloquial level. And we think that's probably because, if you remember, the touch action's a little odd. It's kind of like stroking the carrot, and perhaps all of you were like, that's a strange action. We think that might be what's going on there. But it's, again, evidence that the food-relevant ones are being treated kind of in one way, and the non-food relevant one is in a different way. So for our second question, which food-relevant actions do infants use to infer edibility? This is where we're looking at their choices. And here we're going to break it out into conditions again, because that's how it was presented to the babies. So when we look in the eat versus touch video, the eat versus touch video condition, what we see is that when they're asked which one can you eat, infants choose the root that they saw the actor eat in the video more over the one they just saw the actor touch. And this is replicating previous results in the literature that they use an eating action to infer edibility. Now, for cut versus touch, we actually didn't find any evidence that they use this to infer edibility per se when it is paired with this touching action. So seeing somebody touch the carrot in that interesting way and seeing somebody cut it, they don't seem to be inferring that this thing could be edible. But something different is going on here in the eat versus cut action. So here it's not like the eat action is completely swamping the cut action like it did in the other video set. And this suggests to us potentially that when the cutting action, this food processing action, is occurring in kind of a food-relevant context, it might be being treated differently. So we're still trying to unpack that. If people have thoughts about that, I'd be really, really happy to discuss it. But it's certainly the case that the cut action and the eating action behave differently kind of when they're happening side by side. So this shows us that infants differentially, at 12 months of age, differentially attend to food-relevant actions. They look at these eating and cutting actions longer. But they seem to be exerting greater cognitive effort for a touch control action as measured by their pupil dilation. So it's eating things and cutting things appear to be expected relative to this touch control. And we see that they are using the eating action to infer edibility when it's paired with that touch action. But the cutting action, something might be going on with that, but if it is, it could be context dependent. So there's still more to go to figure out what's actually going on with the cutting action. So do infants differentially attend to food relevant action? The answer here appears to be yes. Okay. So next, we have been investigating infants. Okay, infants are looking for information about plants. They seem to be particularly attentive to actions that could indicate edibility. When they observe those actions, are they selectively learning about plant edibility in a particular way? And a series of studies that I did first during my postdoc and then also in my lab in Berlin in collaboration with Camille Rioux, we were looking at these in 6-month-olds and 18-month-olds, whether they use social information to selectively learn that a plant can be eaten. I will just tell you quickly about the 18-month-old study first, and then I'll tell you about the 6-month-olds. And what we did in these studies is we showed babies an actor eating fruits off of a plant and then eating similar looking fruits off of a human-made object that's matched to low-level features. And our prediction was that despite seeing the same social information of somebody putting a piece of fruit in their mouth, the infants will selectively learn that the plant is edible over the artifact, right? Because human beings, it turns out we put all kinds of artifacts in our mouths all the time, even in food contexts, as we're all here with our forks. And so just having something go in your mouth doesn't necessarily indicate that it's edible. The question here is, are there some things for infants that are more likely to be actual edible candidate food items? And we think plants might be one of those things. So here again, this is a note on counterbalancing. So this is one presentation of the stimuli where we have apricots and dried plums stuck on them. Half the babies saw this configuration, half the babies saw that configuration, right? So this way, what they are across all babies, half are seeing apricots eaten, half are seeing plums eaten, but which one is on the plant and which ones are on the artifact stimuli are counterbalanced. This is how the show looked for the 18-month-olds. Some of you might recognize this guy. This is from back in the postdoc times. So if you're an 18-month-old, this is exactly what you're seeing. So he does the exact same thing with both. And then he puts them down on this board. And here again, everything is counterbalanced. Which one he eats first, which side they're on, which one he picks the fruits off of first. It's all counterbalanced across babies. So after seeing that show, a second experimenter who does not know which fruits came off of which object type brings the board around to the babies and asks,
which one can you eat? That one.
So across the different conditions, when we look at babies' choices, what we see is that when the babies see the eating action with the plant and the human-made artifact, like that baby in the video, as we predicted, even though they saw the same social information applied to both object types, they selected the plant as the thing that could be eaten. But this wasn't, so, and we saw that not only with this, kind of novel artifact, we also did a version where we had stars on a shelf. So it was not, it's still green stuff. It's not perfectly matched for a different number of leaves and things anymore, but it's a more familiar kind of set of shapes and things. Even still, we saw that babies were selecting the plant over the artifact as the thing that could be eaten, even though he ate off of both. But when he performed a different action, so when he stuck the fruit behind his ear, so this is still a human head interaction, but there's no reason to expect that it should be differentially tied to plants. It's kind of equally bizarre with both object types. And when babies see that, they choose equally between the objects. And when babies see no action at all performed directly with the plants and the artifacts, so the experimenter just looks at the plant, looks at the artifact, and then they're asked which one can you eat, they choose equally between these as well. So it seems to be that the critical thing is the eating action paired with the plant is where you get the evidence of this selective social learning. We did a looking time version of this with 6-month-olds who have very little experience with solid food, and we found with the 6-month-olds that they showed evidence that they expected people to eat plants and were surprised when they ate off of these human-made artifacts. And that finding we've actually more recently replicated, again with Camille Ryu, where we were looking at 6-month-olds. This is just to show you, this is what the structure of this study is. We did a direct replication of the finding from 2014, where we paired the eating action with the behind ear action. And then we tried to look in more detail about what's going on here, where we took the fruits off and just had fruits, eating actions on fruits versus an artifact that looked very similar, and eating action on leaves with an artifact that also looks very similar, to try to see if the edibility inferences are tied to the fruits or to the leaves or to something else. And so these are the videos with Camille. Again, this is the direct replication thing, except she says it in German. For the 6-month-olds, then the person freezes, and then we record the baby looking time. And then this is this again. And while the first study was done with live action shots, with a live actor, this was all done with video. So we kept everything the same across babies. And these are, what I'm going to show you are the looking time data from the 6-month-old babies. The prediction here with babies is if something is unexpected to them, they look longer at it. And what we see is that when the experimenter is eating off of the plant versus the human-made artifacts, babies are looking longer when they eat off of the artifact than the plant in the in-mouth condition, and there's no difference in the behind-ear condition. What we saw when we looked at the fruits is when the person ate fruits and then that had come off of a plant versus fruits or these little ball thingies that were stuck on the human-made artifact, is we saw, instead of just the main effect, we saw an interaction where the babies did look longer when the person ate the little balls off of the artifact, but only in the condition where they saw her eat the artifact first. So it suggests it's a somewhat attenuated effect. And when it comes to leaves, pairing the same social information with plant leaves versus a control object, we saw no difference there. So what we see when we look at these expectations of when we look at selective social learning of plant edibility and the expectations that babies have, is that 18-month-olds selectively learn about plant edibility. 6-month-olds have differential expectations about plant edibility. Those edibility expectations seem to be strongest for whole plants, and the fruits picked directly off of whole plants, but they may be, in some sense, differentially tied to fruits. So this is part of what we're following up on now to see what is going on there. So do infants selectively learn about plant edibility? The answer here, we have some evidence that suggests yes, they do. So for the very last thing, I'm just going to present this very briefly, which is do infants generalize plant edibility? So if they learn that that one particular plant is edible, do they extend it to all plants? Or do they only extend it to plants that are similar? And we tested this, again, by having the actor here across 2 experiments with 18-month-olds. We had the actor eat off of one type of plant, so pick off fruits and eat off of one type of plant. And then we gave the infant a choice between the 2 plants on the sides of the stage and looked at what plant the infants chose and then which, if they tried to eat any of the fruits. And what we saw here was that infants chose the same type of plants they had seen the actor eat, and they also ate the same type of fruit that they saw the actor eat. And this is sensible. You wouldn't want to infer that all plants are edible because then you would eat poisonous plants and die. But this is just proof of concept that babies are making these the generalizations about learned plant edibility are following these sensible things where it's the similar looking plants. And we do have evidence from other studies suggesting that across other types of information, the generalization rules that infants apply to plants are based on fine-grained features, and they're relatively cautious. So it does seem to be that the way that infants learn to eat plants does involve these generalization rules that would keep them from getting poisoned as well. So do infants generalize plant edibility? Yes, we have some evidence that they do. And this taken together, if we look at all of this now, it suggests that what infants do, starting at the very top of the talk, when initially confronted with plants, we see some evidence that they avoid plants, but then they seek out social information about plants. They differentially attend to food-relevant actions. They selectively learn about plant edibility, and they generalize this learned information to similar plants using these more cautious generalization strategies. So this is what we have been looking at so far about how infants learn to eat plants. Right? There's a lot more still to do here, but we have this initial stuff underway. So I'll close with some very brief conclusions so we can get to some questions. So the work that I presented today suggests that there are some good reasons why infants would initially avoid plants. Toxic plant chemicals are a real threat, and the behavioral avoidance strategy, along with other mechanisms like food neophobia and dislike of bitter tastes, can help keep infants safe from those kinds of threats. This initial avoidance seems to be coupled with selective social information seeking, selective social learning rules that infants use to learn what kinds of plants in their environment they can eat. And taken together, we have some evidence about how infants learn to eat plants and why they may not want to. So with that, I will close so we can get to some questions. And I would like to thank my students, my collaborators, the funding agencies, and of course, the families who participated in our studies. So thank you very much. I'm looking forward to your questions. Yeah.
Hi. Great talk. Thank you for you. Was there any trends or relationships between individual babies of this baby was more impulsive or this one was typically more cautious? Across all of these studies, were there any? Was the between individual range reliable? I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we did with all of these studies, we had some version of individual difference measure that we asked our parents to fill out. So most of these studies, we had something that we call a plant experience questionnaire, where we ask about their previous experiences with plants. That includes things like how often does your baby try to touch plants? How often do you stop your baby from touching plants? Has your baby ever eaten fruit off of plants before? How often does your baby try to interact with plants? In Germany, we also broke it up by summer and winter, because with the 6-month-old baby, that matters. And so across all of the studies, every now and again, we would get one thing that maybe kind of looked like it would correlate, but in general, not. We also looked at some measures of infant, like infant temperament measures about just kind of general cautiousness and things like that. Again, it didn't really systematically correlate in any way. The one thing that was interesting that's related to the food processing that we found, let me see if I have it. I have a bunch of extra slides back here. I think I stuck this on here. Let's see. We did find in this study where we were looking at whole foods versus cut and picked foods versus the other controls. In addition to finding that the cues of food processing reduced the plant avoidance, we also saw that their avoidance behavior of the older infants in this sample, so these babies were between 15 to 17 months of age, and the older infants in this sample, their avoidance of these cut foods in our study was associated with increased food neophobia about a year later. So it's not, it's not the strongest evidence in the world, but there is some suggestion that there are relationships between these things. Yeah, I mean, sometimes we find things like, you would think for some of the studies that seeing somebody eat off of plants before would have some effect, but it really doesn't seem to. You would think that being told no around plants a lot would have some effect. It really doesn't seem to. I think once we found that if parents tell their babies to stop touching lamps more, they're a little more reluctant to touch lamps. But in the stimulus set, I think I mentioned we had a knife in there. The babies went for the knife really quickly. We have all these videos of like babies waving knives around. And there's no way parents are like telling their babies not to touch knives. So we have checked, and in general, we don't see those things. Good question, yeah. Yeah.
Hey, great talk. So I want to go back to the beginning when you said that you didn't think that there was like a plant module
Yeah.
in brains, right? And I'm thinking about some of Clark's work on the danger avoidance studies of animals, and I take your point about how they're different, but I'm just I'm wondering if you've done anything where you've looked at, I tend to agree that I think knives are kind of its own thing, and you see babies playing with knives everywhere.
Yeah.
Not in our homes maybe,
Right.
but in other
Right, yeah.
places, right? So there may be something very special.
Right.
But I'm wondering how plants square up against other natural dangers like animals. Like if you had like rubber snakes or rubber spiders or taxonomic snakes and spiders and things like that. Like because I'm curious about sort of the magnitude of the effect and where plants fall in the scale of these other things that we have pretty good evidence that they're enacting a similar mechanism of avoidance and things like that.
So I have not, let me see, let me just pull up, I'm sure I have somewhere here's another just image of all of our, this is like in different way, this is a different picture, but this is more stimuli that we've used. So on purpose, we didn't put animate things in our stimuli, and we did it, the reason for us to make that choice was twofold. So one is that fake plants look pretty good, but like fake animals tend to not, right? And then if you have the animals moving, you have this confound of movement, and it's something that we should do, but in the scheme of things, we just didn't get to it yet. The other reason I put that to the side is because there's work actually by Vanessa Lobu at Rutgers from, I think a lot of it was like 2007, 2008-ish to the mid 2015-ish, something like that. She did a bunch of work looking specifically at attention and fear learning to snakes and spiders. And as part of that, she actually did kind of a version of this kind of study where she did have live animals down in front of the kids, including snakes and spiders in cages, contrasted with artifacts. She didn't have plants in that, but she did artifacts versus animals. And what she found is the totality of Vanessa's stuff, and tell me if you have a different interpretation of this, but like the totality of Vanessa's stuff suggests that when it's when it's even those dangerous animals down in front of young, like toddlers, they tend to go to them faster than they go to the artifacts. So they actually approach them faster. They're more interested in them than they are for the artifacts, but then they rapidly pair fear with them. So there's the selective learning of fear. So the way that I read it is that when it's these dangerous animals, what you have is initially there is some kind of like, I don't know whether it's like a general pool of animate things, or like there's interest there, but that the initial thing is actually an approach and an interest that can be turned off by fear learning. And with plants, you have this initial disinterest, right? I don't think it's actually fear with plants. I think what's going on here is something more like disinterest. I actually did collaborate with Robert Hippock, who's at Oxford now when he was still in Leipzig, looking at pupil dilation in one of our tasks because it can be a measure of arousal. And then we both went off to different places, and those data are just sitting on a hard drive, like waiting for somebody to analyze them. And hopefully we'll get to that, because that could give us some clues about maybe what's going on. But I can say, having run a bunch of these studies, watched a ton of these videos, I don't think they're afraid. I think it's disinterest and then, okay, human, what do I do with this? So for animals, it seems interest, which can be turned off. And for plants, it's disinterest, which then you can learn things, which kind of overrides that initial avoidance and disinterest. So anyway, what I think of it, I don't know. Yeah.
I was wondering if you thought of other sort of plant-adjacent things. So I see a lot of like bushy, shrubby objects here, right? And
Yeah.
even the novel artifacts, there's like one thorny artifact. I was wondering things like green plants or like desert plants, like succulents, for example. Like those are things that other cultures or people from places around the world maybe encounter more often in their lives.
Yes.
I mean, I think in North America we see a lot of these like grassy green plants, but
Yes.
have you looked into that or like thought about expanding sort of the set of what are considered plants?
Yeah, that's a great question, and the answer is yes, and it's the first set of stuff we're getting ready to do in my new lab. So, and what we're starting with, though, I will say, what we're starting with to make it comparable to this is we're starting with within these kinds of plants, what happens if they have fruits? What happens if they have flowers? What happens if the leaves are different colors? What happens if the leaves are dead is what I'm very interested in, because if it's plant toxins, like dead should matter. But what I imagine we will do, if I can keep subsequent students interested in it, is just kind of always have these kinds of studies running in the background where we can look at different features and different kinds of plants and different, get a broader representative sample than just those kinds of things. But yeah, it's a great question. Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. So I thought it was really interesting. I had a question about, so part of your study is why wouldn't infants want to eat them?
Mm-hmm.
But it's sort of like, I feel like your research more about why they don't want to touch them or like disinterested in them. And it's sort of, you already touched on that a little bit, that might be why they don't want to eat them, but
Yeah.
but I sort of like want to just ask about, like in real life, infants don't actually eat raw plants a lot. Like parents were usually cooked or like processed the plants already for them, and then
Yeah.
after they're processed, they might not look like the
Yes.
original plants at all. So like, have you sort of just like looked into that, like whether they are willing to eat like processed plant, and then sort of does that still like the same as what we've seen in the touching scenario?
Yeah, and this is I just want to put up just this because I like these pictures. So so you're exactly right that many things that babies, like the babies we're studying in Germany and in the US, many of the things they get are, well, first of all, the younger babies, it's mostly breast milk or formula. And then later on, they're getting some version of processed foods. One of the things we want to do next, the studies with the 6-month-olds and the looking times, is one of the reasons we started kind of like pulling the plants apart is because we want to keep going down the processing steps and look at exactly that. So what happens for their expectations about things that are cut up, things that are mashed, things that look very different than the whole plants? Do they have to see that process happening? Do they need to, or is it something they can infer from just seeing the outcome of that process? Which is, again, something I'm thinking about. Like, we can get series of videos and just run lots of conditions of this. I will say, so Camille, my former postdoc, she had some work from her PhD that suggested that food neophobia was, in some cases, seems to be associated with worse categorization abilities in younger kids, basically because they have a hard time recognizing that this is the same kind of thing they've seen before. So if they have better categorization abilities and they can better recognize that this food is the same thing I've seen before, then they're less likely to show food neophobia. And so there does seem to be something there with the categorization piece as well. One thing, I mean, this picture is actually, I think, one of Mike Gervin's pictures. I mean, this is the kind of thing, though, that babies are probably set up to see. Like, babies participate in, or they're there for a lot of things that actually happen with foods, where they see the whole chain of, like, the whole foods are brought back and they're there, and from 2 to 3 years of age, they're often participating in food preparation and food processing, food processing in and around their home with their parents. And depending on where you look, by like 2 to 5, 6, something like that, the kids are going out and foraging on their own, even pretty young, but they tend to specialize in things that you don't have to process. So they're like getting berries and stuff like that that you can just eat, I think. So there's sort of, it's a lot of saying a lot of different things at you, but it's basically the idea is I think there will be a class of things that they are just eating right off of the plants, right? And don't require a lot of inferences that this is the same thing that, this thing that came off the plant is the same thing I can eat. It's like a more direct thing. Food processing is going to be a big part of things that complicates things. The fact that our babies in the US and Germany and places where we're not participating in food processing a lot, they might be missing a lot of information about what is and isn't edible, and it may be why we see some of these associations with these categorization skills, where the kids who are better at that are less likely to show this kind of neophobia.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. Really interesting. I just wanted to ask a little bit about sort of evolutionary motivation that you mentioned near the beginning, because as you pointed out, like, plants present a number of ancestrally recurrent threats, both in touching them, eating them, and that definitely makes sense. But it is a little surprising to me then that we would see the kinds of dispositions in infants of this age, just because we're looking at 6 to 18 months old.
Yeah.
I can imagine even in the evolutionary context, they were often choosing plants to eat. They would either been being fed by their mother or like given food.
Yeah.
And especially at the younger age range, probably the same goes for touching plants. I mean,
Yeah.
they might crawl around a little bit, but you're unlikely to die, I would think, from crawling around the camp. So it was a little surprising to me to see, not that these kinds of dispositions exist, but that they show up so early.
Yeah.
Is that surprising? Yeah. Does that seem surprising to you, or do you think there's like something that can be said there?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, so this is something that comes up in infant cognition research all the time, right? Is when you see evidence of these things very early, why are they there, right? And there's a couple of different general responses that, and I should say, I don't know what the answer is for this, so I can give you the possibility space as I see it, though. So I think in some instances, the things are there because they're useful for babies in the moment. And I would say that actually the plant avoidance thing may be that, because babies, they're crawling around, they're walking around by 6 to 9 months of age. They can get into trouble pretty quickly. And so even if you imagine you just need a little bit of lead time to like build that kind of response, you could imagine that that's something that is useful in infancy. Both the avoidance and then the kind of like looking for what are people telling me I should or shouldn't do with this thing. When it comes to things like the edibility stuff, like are they going out foraging at 6 months of age? No, not to do it themselves. So then the question becomes, is it there because it's something about a developmental process that needs something there early to like build the later things? So you can think of language like this in a way. There's all of these parts that babies do in the course of language development where they're not speaking yet, but they're doing these like precursor things that are presumably there that unfold in these specific, in these, you know, these regularized ways that eventually build a language. So am I seeing evidence that they have these expectations about what can and can't be eaten because at that point they may need that as sort of a precursor step to building the later mechanisms? Or is it just like it's there, it doesn't need to, it's just for whatever reason there's just like a piece of that there and it's just hanging around and we're seeing evidence of it. And fundamentally what you're asking are developmental questions, right? And I think one of the things that is always interesting in infant cognition kind of stuff is the question is normally, can we find it, right? Like, is it there? Is there evidence of it there? And the next step really does need to be, what is the actual developmental progression of this thing? And then maybe that would help answer the question. And with this, I don't know yet, but I do know that across infant cognition research generally, there's evidence of all kinds of things being present, at least pieces of them being present early at points where you wouldn't think you need a fully functioning system then. And we just don't know enough yet about the actual cognitive development to be able to answer why it's there. Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah.
Yeah, great talk. I was interested in that one slide at the beginning where you have, I was interested in all of it, but that, that slide that said that even in adult humans this persists. And this is in, I mean, I know a lot of industrial adult humans who are phenomenally plant blind. I mean, just to a mind-boggling degree. You even can't tell the same, or, you know, send people to the grocery store and they come back with the completely wrong thing.
Yes.
I mean, and I'm just wondering if the mechanisms by which adults decide whether they think it's safe to eat it. I mean, there's also humans, adult humans who are just so reluctant to include vegetables in their diet, period. So it just seems like a huge issue for adults as well, and I wondered what kind of scholarship has been done trying to figure out the developmental trajectory beyond infancy into adulthood.
I mean, at this point, for looking at this, so there, I am sure there is probably more work on this on food neophobia per se. And I don't know the details of into adulthood for that, but I think there must be work that would answer that question for food neophobia, or at least have a good, like a solid basis for answering that question. For the plant avoidance thing, the way that we measured that was we actually did a covert task to do it. So we gave German adults our stimuli and just told them, we use these stimuli for babies and we're interested in how you think about them. And we just put them down in front of them and we just measured when they touched the top parts. And that's how we saw that there was still that delay there. And I mean, again, it's just they're taking a little bit longer to do it. But it is one of the things I think about all this time with the work, and this again goes back to the developmental questions. The babies that we look at, that we've spent most of our time and energy looking at in the US and in Germany, they're babies who are with very strange adults, right? Very strange adults who tend to know nothing about plants, who maybe it would be very interesting to look at people who do actually have plant knowledge as adults, and maybe the plants that you know and you recognize and you know are safe, there's no avoidance there, but then you would know plants that are dangerous, you might see even stronger avoidance, if not total avoidance, depending on the particular plant. And we haven't gotten to that yet. But it's something I've thought about, but not as much as I've been thinking about the little ones. Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah.
Other animal species who eat plants face the same dilemma.
Yeah.
Do we know much about how their infants learn, or if they have to learn, or how it works?
I mean, so we did this. Yeah, so this was one of my other former postdocs. We did this both actually in collaboration. I must have that. So we looked at 5 different non-human primate species as a way to do this. There are people who have also looked at just behavioral ecologists, just looking at what animals do, and I can talk about that in a second. But I can show you, just because this is the project where we kind of directly tested what we did. This was the project we did human adults for this, because when we tested these non-human primate species, we had adults to test, right? We actually, with capuchins, the person that I did the capuchin studies with was Laurie Santos when she had her capuchins at Yale still when I was a postdoc there. And she and I actually tried to test juveniles, juvenile rhesus macaques on Cayo Santiago, and we could not get them to leave their parents long enough to actually be able to test them. And then in the captive species, there just aren't juveniles. So we tested adults, and that's why we also tested adult humans to just kind of see what was going on with adult humans. But for these, so the capuchins were tested at Yale. The rest of the species were tested at the Wolfgang Kohler Primate Research Center in Leipzig, Germany. We gave them our stimuli plus a couple of ape familiar stimuli as well. And the way that we did it is we made like a plexiglass plate with a hole in it so they could stick their fingers through, which kept these big guys from just like grabbing and completely destroying the objects. And this is just kind of the overview of what we found of plant versus non-plant objects. And what we saw is that that's the human adults, right, where they take longer to touch plants than the non-plant objects. We see in chimpanzees a similar pattern where they're taking longer to touch plants than the non-plants. Orangutans, it's in that direction, but there's only 5, so we're a little bit cautious about that. Bonobos, there was no difference. Gorillas and capuchins, we're seeing the flip effect where they're treating plants different from the non-plant objects, but they're actually faster on the plants than the non-plant objects. So this was, again, because we're just starting to do this, we're at the level of basically describing what's going on. We think because there were 2 possible patterns of data here. One possible pattern is you see this across all primate species, right? That somebody hit on this and then it just got preserved. But again, we don't see that. We see that there are differences, which suggests that there's something more complicated going on with physiology, natural ecology, other kinds of plant avoidance strategies. It's definitely the case that because many animals have faced this problem for such a long time, there's quite a lot of other defenses that aren't just the reluctance to touch. It's kind of one of many, and it suggests that even though it looks like it's a good one for human babies to be using, and other non-human primates, other primate species may use it as well, but it's not across the board. But we have so much to do to figure out exactly what's going on, but this is what we know now.
I have a question about stuff you haven't done yet, which
Yeah,
I've been
okay.
working on all the time. But how do you think things would change in these results if the information that kids were getting was not communicative?
Yeah.
Because these are like demonstrations, and then there's interesting things there about demonstrations, right?
Yes.
Including a lot of the stuff that kids learn might not come through that modality, but also.
Yes.
It's much easier to demonstrate that something is safe than that something is dangerous.
Yes. Yes.
Through a demonstration.
Yeah.
And that can possibly be why things like knives and things like that, or guns, it's difficult to teach kids how dangerous they are.
Right.
Certainly you can't do it through demonstration.
Right.
So I'm just wondering, in these cases, do you think the results would change in any way? If they were just overseeing, sort of observing people doing these things, or?
It's a good question. I hope not, right? Because this is why the front end of this is all what are they paying attention to? Because I do think that this is probably something that is just like there's opportunities to observe these things. Nobody's really teaching you per se, but you should be keyed in, or like the systems should be keyed in on this kind of information. So my background assumption is this is largely an observational kind of social learning thing, and this is how we're testing this. But it would be great to look at it in. It would be good to try to figure out how we could look at it in a more incidental way. I mean, we have done some stuff where it's not exactly this, but like so we did look at what just like parents and children do in the garden. I can't remember if that's just the video. So we just kind of like looked at what they did, but it was still a more the parent was still showing what was going on with the plants. We also did a gardening study that we did. This is still, we're finally finishing the coding for this at a German like preschool daycare situation. And in the course of doing that study, we had things that our experimenters were explicitly teaching about what was going on with the plants, but we also popped in a lot of covert gestures that we had them doing to see if the kids would imitate those. And so we're working through, this ended up being, we had like 50 kids participating each year in these things over 3 years. So the video coding project has been daunting, but we're almost at the end of that where we can actually start hopefully looking through the data and seeing what's going on there. Because again, like I do think probably in many cases this is observational, right?
So just follow on about that, I think one thing I noticed in the demonstrative video is that all the experiments are looking down when they're cutting the carrots. So I think that lack of joint attention might have sort of add some more like observation condition,
Yeah. But yeah, it's, I mean, because we, the videos that we present to babies, like, they're odd, right? Like, in my lab, we always say there's no shame in baby lab, like, when you're doing these things, because when you're doing the studies, it's trying to kind of, like, match across things so you can try to isolate what the piece of information is that the babies are actually paying attention to. But it's right, we did try to make them not overtly like, hey, look, see what I'm doing? But we still had, it was still it's still obviously like a single individual demonstrating for a baby. So yeah, that's another thing though would be to do studies where we really crank up the pedagogical stuff and then really like have it very low and see what goes on there. So as soon as I can get curtains in my lab and graduate students. So again, if you know people for next year, there's plenty to do. There's like a ton to do, which is good.
All right, I think we've reached the end of our time. So thank you, Annie, for, I'm sorry, is there another question?
Well, I was going to follow up on that, but we're out of time. So.
All right.
Thank you again.